Picture this, a child barely 3 years old, stumbling through the mud of a Roman military camp. His feet are bound in miniature sandals, Caligula, crafted by hardened legionaries who adored the boy's presence. It was meant to be affectionate, a soldier's jest. From it came the nickname that history would never forget, Caligula, the little boot. But this was no nursery. The lullabies that rocked his childhood were the clash of iron shields, the screams of the dying, and the acrid stench of blood mingled with smoke. To the soldiers, war was routine. To the boy, it was home. And in that crucible, the foundations of something monstrous began to take shape. His father, Germanicus, was Rome's golden general, beloved by his men, celebrated by the people, and feared by Rome's enemies. Wherever Germanicus marched, the empire's banners followed, radiant with the promise of victory. For young Caligula, the general was not merely a father but the very embodiment of power. He learned early that loyalty was won not through kindness, but through awe and fear. Then came the catastrophe. In 19 AD, Germanicus died mysteriously in Syria. Some whispered of poison, others of political conspiracy. What matters is that the empire's golden hero collapsed into the dust, and a 6-year-old boy watched the light drain from his world. The transformation was swift and merciless. Caligula's mother, Agrippina the Elder, once the proud matron of Rome's first family, unraveled before his eyes. Her grief fermented into paranoia, her sorrow into suspicion. She whispered of assassins in the marble corridors, of daggers hidden behind every smile. In the palace of emperors, young Caligula absorbed her terror as if it were scripture. This was his education, not letters and scrolls, but betrayal and blood. He learned that love could vanish in an instant, that trust was a weakness, and that survival meant mastering fear before it mastered you. Modern psychology tells us children exposed to brutality internalize it, twisting it into their sense of normal. But in Caligula's case, the lessons ran deeper. He didn't simply witness violence, he was nourished by it. The laughter of soldiers recounting mutilations, the cheers for victory built on corpses, these were the lullabies that shaped him. And so, by the time Rome looked upon the boy with admiration, dressing him as a symbol of its future glory, they had already sown the seeds of their own destruction. In the shadow of Germanicus's legacy, a child was learning that the empire's greatest strength was also its most dangerous weapon, the ability to make human suffering into a spectacle. The little boot would grow, and one day, he would turn all of Rome into his battlefield. The island of Capri in the year 31 AD. To poets, it was a paradise of blue seas and marble villas perched upon cliffs. To the Roman elite, it was a retreat for the emperor. But to the young Caligula, barely a teenager, Capri was a hell disguised as heaven. The ruler of this island was Emperor Tiberius, his great-uncle. History remembers Tiberius as a brooding, paranoid old man, but here, in his twilight years, his appetites had curdled into something darker. The island became his private theater of corruption. Ancient whispers tell us of the little fishes, children trained for the emperor's twisted pleasure, forced into acts so vile that even Rome's cynical chroniclers struggled to put them into words. Marble halls echoed with the laughter of broken innocence. Guests arrived as dignified senators, governors, and nobles, only to leave hollow-eyed and shamed. Rooms were designed for obscenity, filled with mirrors and hidden alcoves where power and cruelty intertwined. It was here that Caligula, the boy already shaped by war and loss, began his true education. Most children placed in such an environment would fracture under the weight of trauma. They would shatter, become victims, or vanish into despair. But Caligula was not most children. He watched. He learned. He perfected the art of silence. His face, still boyish, could beam with charm and obedience, even as his mind was cataloguing every cruelty. He saw how Tiberius used fear like a sculptor uses clay, molding men's spirits with whispers of death, bending loyalty with the thread of shame. He saw how the emperor made desire into a weapon, how humiliation became a currency of power. Each vile ritual was not merely a spectacle, it was a lesson. Suetonius tells us that Tiberius never suspected the mask Caligula wore. Behind the polite smiles and dutiful obedience, the boy was memorizing everything: the techniques of manipulation, the psychology of terror, the 1,000 ways in which power could twist human flesh and spirit. Capri was his classroom, and the subject was domination. By the time Tiberius grew frail, Caligula was no longer the boy in little boots. He was a shadow in waiting, a vessel filled with darkness, ready to step into Rome not as a victim of corruption but as its most perfected product. Capri had not broken him, it had refined him. The paradise of the poets was, in truth, the crucible of a monster. And when Caligula left its shores, he carried with him lessons that would soon drench an empire in fear, humiliation, and blood. The year is 37 AD. The old emperor, Tiberius, lies dead, some whisper poisoned, others claim nature finally caught up to him. Into the void steps a young man only 18 years old, known to Rome as Gaius Caesar Germanicus, the son of the empire's golden general. To the soldiers, to the people, he was Caligula, the little boot they once adored in childhood. And for a brief, dazzling moment, Rome believed salvation had come. After years of Tiberius' paranoia, secret trials, and endless executions, the new emperor opened the prisons. Political captives walked free into the sunlight. Gold poured into the hands of the Praetorian Guard, securing their loyalty. Bread was distributed, and grand spectacles filled the Circus Maximus. The empire erupted in celebration. Senators bowed in relief, citizens wept with joy, and mothers lifted their children high to see the youthful emperor who promised renewal. But hope is a dangerous illusion. The mask soon slipped. Behind the feasts and parades, a darker theater was being staged, one not of joy, but of humiliation. Caligula had learned from Capri that true power was not in swords or legions. It was in the ability to bend the will of Rome's proudest men until their dignity shattered. Imagine an imperial banquet: golden lamps flicker across marble walls, goblets overflow with wine. The emperor rises, his face glowing with youthful vigor. He gestures casually toward the wives and daughters of Rome's most respected senators, describing their beauty in public, as if he were appraising livestock. Then, with a smile, he declares his intention to take one of them into his chambers. The room falls silent. The chosen woman trembles, her eyes lowered. Her husband, a man who commands armies and presides over laws, forces a smile. To protest would mean death, not just for himself, but for his entire family. And so he nods, pretending gratitude, even as his heart is torn apart. This was Caligula's true genius, transforming pleasure into spectacle, lust into a weapon of political terror. What appeared to the crowd as youthful indulgence was, in truth, carefully calculated degradation. Each public humiliation struck at the foundations of Roman honor, stripping the Senate of its pride and transforming noble families into playthings of the throne. The people who once praised him as savior began to whisper. The golden boy of Germanicus was gone. In his place stood a ruler who understood that Rome's greatest weakness was not its enemies on the frontier, but the pride of its own elite. And he would break them, one banquet, one family, one humiliation at a time. The hope of 37 AD had birthed not salvation, but a nightmare draped in purple. In the glittering halls of Rome's imperial palace, the new emperor is not alone on his throne. At his side sits a young woman, radiant, admired, and whispered about throughout the empire, his sister, Drusilla. For Rome, siblings in the imperial family symbolized continuity and stability. But for Caligula, family ties became something darker, twisted into obsession. Drusilla was not simply his sister. To him, she was the object of a devotion that blurred the boundaries of blood, power, and desire. Ancient sources tell us Caligula adored her openly, more like a wife than a sister. At public ceremonies, he gazed at her not with the affection of family but with the intensity of possession. He seated her beside him in the Senate, invited her to join him at state rituals, and let no one mistake her importance. To the Roman people, the message was unmistakable: Drusilla was not just a woman of the Julian line, she was the emperor's chosen. But behind closed doors, admiration turned into something far more disturbing. Caligula, who had learned from Tiberius that power could twist love into terror, subjected Drusilla to rituals that blurred worship with degradation. In one moment, he crowned her with laurels and called her a goddess; in the next, he forced her into ceremonies that stripped her dignity, testing how far he could bend even those he claimed to love. Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla, his other sisters, were drawn into this nightmare. Sources suggest he compelled them to participate in rituals meant to shatter bonds of trust, turning affection into rivalry, intimacy into humiliation. Where Rome saw noble daughters of Germanicus, Caligula saw only instruments, objects to break, mold, and corrupt. Then came the turning point. In 38 AD, Drusilla fell gravely ill. Accounts differ, perhaps disease, perhaps the toll of his relentless obsession, but her death shook Caligula to his core. The emperor who never wept for the suffering of others collapsed in despair, not as a brother mourning a sister, but as a man bereft of his most prized possession. His grief became policy. He declared Drusilla a goddess, ordering temples built in her name. Statues were erected, sacrifices offered. The empire was forced into mourning, senators bowing their heads as if a queen had died. To fail to grieve was treason. But beneath the divine honors lay something more chilling. Caligula's devotion was not simply love, it was obsession weaponized. He had elevated Drusilla to the heavens not out of reverence, but out of desperation to immortalize what he had lost. Her death left a void he would spend the rest of his reign trying to fill, with substitutes, with violence, with ever-escalating horrors. Rome had seen emperors deify wives, mothers, and ancestors before. But never had the empire been forced to worship a sister, mourn a goddess born of incest, and bow to the emperor's madness. The age of divine Drusilla was not a sign of Rome's glory, it was the omen of its unraveling. The Circus Maximus, Rome's grand arena. For centuries, it had been the stage of martial honor, gladiators clashing steel to steel, wild beasts hunted before roaring crowds. Blood was spilled, yes, but it was blood framed as valor. Then came Caligula. To him, the arena was not about courage or spectacle. It was about humiliation. Under his reign, the sands of the Circus Maximus became stained not only with blood, but with shame. Wives and daughters of defeated enemies, even the families of Rome's nobility, were dragged onto the stage. They were not there to fight, but to be paraded, degraded, and broken before the eyes of thousands. Imagine the horror: a senator, seated in the imperial box, watches as his daughter is forced into the arena. His hands grip the edge of the bench until his knuckles whiten, his lips pressed into silence. Around him, other nobles bow their heads, some in pity, others in fear, knowing that at any moment, their own families could be chosen. Caligula watched, not the victims themselves, but the faces of those forced to witness. Bronze mirrors and polished shields were placed around the arena, reflecting the anguish of parents, the silent sobs of mothers, the fury of powerless husbands. To him, these expressions were the true entertainment, the currency of his pleasure. What began as shock slowly shifted. The Roman crowd, at first horrified into silence, grew restless. Then came the laughter, the cheers, the applause. Caligula had done more than corrupt the arena, he had corrupted the very spirit of Rome. Where once citizens celebrated courage, they now reveled in humiliation. The emperor sat enthroned above it all, his youthful face radiant in torchlight, his eyes cold as steel. He did not cheer the gladiators. He did not roar with the mob. He leaned forward, studying, dissecting the despair of his victims like a physician examining wounds. The games became laboratories of degradation. The arena was no longer a stage of combat, but a theater of cruelty where the emperor tested the breaking point of human dignity. By 40 AD, the transformation was complete. What had once been Rome's pride became its shame. Citizens who had once recoiled at the sight of families debased now shouted for more. Rome itself was unraveling, its soul poisoned by the emperor's perverse design. The Circus Maximus no longer belonged to the gladiators. It belonged to Caligula, and he had turned it into a mirror of the empire's decay. The year is 40 AD. Behind the marble walls of the imperial palace, Caligula builds something unprecedented in Roman history. Not a harem for pleasure, as Eastern kings might keep, but a living laboratory, a machine of sexual and psychological terror. Women were not chosen for beauty alone. Each selection was deliberate, calculated like a general choosing targets for conquest. The daughter of a decorated general, the wife of a proud senator, the beloved child of a wealthy merchant, every victim was hand-picked to ensure that her degradation would ripple outward, staining entire families, whole communities. The harem was organized with chilling precision. Rooms were designed not as sanctuaries of luxury, but as stages for systematic violation. Scribes were appointed to keep records, noting each reaction, each breakdown, each tear. Administrators compiled scrolls detailing the psychological collapse of noble households. This was not random cruelty, it was data collection, cruelty refined into research. And Caligula forced Rome's fathers and husbands into complicity. A senator would be summoned to deliver his daughter to the palace, bowing as if it were an honor. A husband would be ordered to prepare his wife, dressing her in silk for the emperor's attention. To resist meant destruction of the entire bloodline. To comply meant becoming a collaborator in one's own family's ruin. Survivors of the harem did not leave as they entered. When they were finally cast out, they carried with them a kind of living death, haunted eyes, fractured spirits, broken bodies that still bore the marks of the emperor's experiments. They were forced back into Roman society, returning to families who no longer recognized them, yet carrying with them the corruption that spread like a plague. Caligula, ever the student of manipulation, studied not just the women, but their families. He examined how noble houses disintegrated under the weight of shame, how friendships fractured when scandal touched them, how communities turned inward in fear when one of their own was chosen. He weaponized not only bodies, but bonds of loyalty, trust, and love. Rome had seen tyrants before. It had witnessed bloodshed, civil war, and cruelty. But never had the empire faced a ruler who turned human intimacy into a system of terror, who recorded suffering with the detachment of a scholar, who transformed the private chamber into a theater of humiliation. By 40 AD, the harem had grown into an institution, a bureaucratic machine of degradation with scribes, guards, and administrators all complicit. And its survivors, scattered back into the world, became Caligula's most insidious legacy, walking reminders of the empire's corruption, seeds of decay planted in every corner of Roman life. The harem was not a place. It was a weapon. And Rome itself was the target. The temples of Rome, once the sacred heart of the empire. Altars where priests once whispered solemn prayers now echo with the twisted laughter of debased rituals. What was once divine has been dragged into the dirt. Under Caligula's rule, Rome's religion became a theater of blasphemy. Sacred festivals, once held in reverence, were transformed into spectacles of corruption. Priests, once guardians of tradition, were forced at sword point to sanctify ceremonies that resembled orgies more than rituals. Statues of gods, carved in marble to embody Rome's dignity, stood cold and silent as men and women were humiliated beneath their gaze. Caligula proclaimed these acts holy decrees, twisting faith into justification for perversion. The impact rippled outward. Marriage, once the cornerstone of Roman virtue, became a target. To marry into nobility was no longer a blessing, but a curse. Husbands feared their wives might be summoned, fathers dreaded the day their daughters would be chosen. The very bonds that held families together, loyalty, protection, honor, were systematically poisoned. Picture a Roman father at a feast, his hands trembling as he hears the emperor's jest about his daughter. Picture a mother who hides her child in the countryside, knowing that the emperor's eye could fall on her at any moment. Every household lived with the same terror, that love itself could be weaponized, turned into their undoing. And yet, beneath this blanket of fear, something else began to stir. Hatred. Resentment. A silent fury building in the hearts of the humiliated. Caligula thought he was breaking Rome, but in truth, he was forging its resolve. Whispers grew in shadowed corridors. Senators, once cowed into silence, began to trade glances heavy with unspoken rebellion. Soldiers, forced to enforce the emperor's decrees, carried within them the guilt of complicity, and the smoldering need for redemption. Even priests, their voices trembling in false praise, began to dream of vengeance against the tyrant who mocked their gods. By desecrating Rome's faith, Caligula had struck not just at individuals, but at the very soul of the empire. He thought he had bound the people in terror. In reality, he had united them in hatred. The empire was rotting from within, yes, but within that rot, seeds of resistance began to grow. The stage was being set. The emperor had turned Rome's sacred traditions into his weapon. Soon, those same traditions, family, honor, and faith, would become the fire that consumed him. After 3.5 years of terror, Rome no longer saw a man when they looked at their emperor. They saw something else, something twisted beyond recognition. Caligula, once the golden son of Germanicus, had become a creature that blurred the line between human and monster. The palace had turned into a theater of madness. Rituals once sacred to Rome's gods were now desecrated by the emperor's delusions. He staged ceremonies where he claimed to couple with the divine, forcing senators, soldiers, and priests to watch in silence. Those who did not cheer were marked, those who looked away vanished. The marble halls reeked not only of incense and wine, but of fear so thick it was suffocating. Among those watching was Cassius Chaerea, an officer of the Praetorian Guard. Once loyal, he had been humiliated time and again, forced into obscene participation in the emperor's spectacles. Each insult, each violation, had carved itself into his soul until his loyalty rotted into rage. He was not alone. Soldiers, senators, even palace servants, all carried the scars of Caligula's tyranny. And so, in the shadows, conspiracy took root. This was not a plot for power. It was vengeance, born from humiliation and terror. The conspirators whispered in corridors, blades hidden beneath their cloaks, their eyes burning with the shared fury of thousands of silenced voices. The day came, January 24, 41 AD. Caligula attended a performance, laughing, basking in the forced adoration of those who hated him. When the play ended, he rose to leave the theater, draped in purple, a crown glittering on his brow. His guards moved with him, the senators bowed, the crowd parted. But in the corridor, waiting in the half-light of torches, stood Chaerea and his men. Their faces were grim, their hands tight on their hilts. Caligula sneered, mocking Chaerea as he had done so many times before. But this time, the officer did not endure. The first blade struck. Then another. And another. Chaos erupted in the marble passage. Caligula staggered, his youthful face twisted in disbelief and fury. Blades rained down, 30 in total, each strike a voice for the countless victims who had never been allowed to scream. Blood pooled across the polished stone, the purple of his robes drowned in crimson. The monster was dead. Not by trial, not by decree, but by the raw explosion of vengeance. Rome, scarred and broken, had finally struck back. The tyrant who turned faith into mockery and love into weapons fell not as a god, but as a man, pierced, bleeding, abandoned. And in the silence that followed, the empire dared to hope again. Rome, 41 AD. The tyrant is dead, his body discarded in a shallow grave, but the empire he scarred remains alive. And though the dagger ended Caligula's life, it could not erase what his reign had done to Rome's soul. The survivors of his terror walked the streets like ghosts. Noble women returned to their homes, but their eyes were hollow, their spirits fractured. Fathers and husbands, forced to offer their loved ones to the emperor, lived out their days with the silent weight of complicity. Soldiers of the Praetorian Guard, who had carried out his commands, bore guilt as deep as the scars of those they once dragged into the palace. The victims carried their trauma into marriages, into families, into generations yet unborn. The institutions of Rome, its military, its priesthood, its senate, were poisoned. The army had become an enforcer of humiliation instead of protector. Priests had been forced to sanctify obscenity. Senators had been broken into puppets, their dignity stripped piece by piece. When Caligula died, these institutions did not immediately heal, they staggered, hollow and weakened, shadows of what they had been. Historians of later ages faced a choice. How much of the truth could be written without shaking the very foundations of imperial legitimacy? And so, many details were buried. Records destroyed. Accounts softened. The horrors of the harem, the rituals of blasphemy, the systematic degradation of Rome's families, these were left in fragments, whispered through the centuries, too dangerous to record in full. To admit the truth was to admit that the system itself had allowed a monster to rule unchecked. And yet, fragments survive. Enough to remind us that Caligula's reign was not merely the madness of one man, but a warning. When absolute power falls into the hands of the deranged, civilization itself becomes the instrument of its own destruction. Picture walking through modern Rome, past the ruins of the Circus Maximus, where cheers once masked shame, past the shattered remains of temples where gods were mocked. The stones remember. They remember the screams, the humiliation, the silent breaking of Rome's proudest families. Caligula's ghost lingers not in marble statues or forgotten scrolls, but in the lesson his reign carved into history, that unchecked power is the enemy of human dignity. Rome survived, yes, but it survived scarred, forever carrying the memory of how close it came to losing its soul. The nightmare of Caligula reminds us still, when the sick and the sadistic sit on the throne, empires themselves can be devoured from within.